Hello, and welcome to the library of the Faculty of Theology in Louvain-la-Neuve in Belgium. Theologians like myself are often very much aware of the recent evolutions in science, and they try to engage the conversation between scientific research and the theological understanding of the world. Often, scientists are unaware of the interest they stir in theological circles, and of the interest of their work for theological development. I believe in cross-fertilization and in transdisciplinary conversation, which is why I hope that my presentation may be of interest for scientists working in the field of artificial intelligence, whether or not one admits the existence of God. However, I am not a mathematician, nor am I a specialist in artificial intelligence. My field is profound intellectual disability and cognitive impairment, which gives me an original approach to the value of error. Indeed, the lives of the people I work with are characterized by vulnerability, dependence, and doubt. And more than once have I been told that these persons are errors of creation, or even errors of nature. Some think that the development of AI may correct or even prevent the onset of intellectual disability. My question for today is, should human beings strive to develop an AI capable of eradicating vulnerability, dependence, and doubt? In my short presentation, I would like to see if bringing a theological argument into the conversation on AI can help orient our reflection on the value of error in the age of robotics. But before trying to answer that question, let me tell you a story. It is a story about God and creation and people with Down syndrome. You have all seen illustrations of the biblical account of creation. The Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, God creating the universe in 6 days. And you are probably familiar with these kind of images. Most of the illustrations show a lush garden, beautiful animals, and a nice-looking couple of human beings. People with disabilities are never used to illustrate the creation story. That is because in our collective Christian imagination, God created a perfect world, where there is no place for disability, sickness, or death, aspects of what is commonly referred to as vulnerability. Recreating a perfect world seems for some people the goal of humanity, and some think AI could help humanity achieve it. I have written elsewhere that from a biblical point of view, there is no reason to assume God created humankind invulnerable, immortal, without disabilities. On the contrary. That is why I actively advocate to illustrate the creation story with images of people of all abilities, even those categorized by some as errors of creation. Now here is my story. It is a story about my friend Beatrice, who has just retired from a life of hard work. She lives together with her husband George in the east of France. Beatrice cannot read. She can hardly write her own name. But she likes it when we read the Gospel together and try to understand Jesus' teachings. When I was researching why persons with disabilities are never used to illustrate the creation story, I showed them this photo of a couple of persons with Down syndrome. And I asked if they could represent Adam and Eve. I even went to the French National Service for Religious Education and Disability. I was told there that people with disabilities don't want to see themselves in this story. I don't know how the French National Service came to this conclusion, but it is not in line with my own findings. I went to see my friends Beatrice and George and asked them whether they thought this couple could represent Adam and Eve. George looked intently at the picture and said that the woman in the photo surely didn't look much like the Eve in his Bible book. But Beatrice took a much longer look to study the couple in the photo. And then she said, "These people seem to love one another, don't they?" I said, "They surely do." Beatrice said, "I think God wants them to love one another, doesn't he?" I replied, "I think so, yes." Beatrice concluded, "Then what is your problem?" So I ask you, what is the problem? The stakes are high. If we admit that God created a world where the vulnerable, dependent and doubtful lives of Beatrice and George are unintended mistakes, then trying to create a world without them could be a laudable goal. But are we sure the world would be more humane without them? This brings me to my second point. Are vulnerability, dependence and doubt a problem, errors to be deleted? Now, I identify as a theologian of disability, and as such I posit that God created human beings free and vulnerable. Building an argument on freedom is always a hazardous enterprise, because the very concept of freedom is so entangled in ideological, philosophical and theological discourse. Still, that is what I want to do now from a Christian theological point of view. Human beings were created free, out of love, for themselves and for the glory of God. That is Christian teaching. Human freedom, bestowed on humans by God, implies that human beings are not puppets and that God is not a giant puppeteer. And just a side issue, in an age of robotics, it is useful to remember that robots were not invented out of love. Robots were invented to work for human beings. Their reason for being is to do tasks human beings can't or won't do. The dirty, the dangerous and the dull. Or to entertain human beings. Robotic existence is therefore rather utilitarian and slave-like. Now, human beings were not created as slaves. They were created free. And notwithstanding a certain amount of deterministic genetic dependency, I strongly believe in a non-algorithmic, undeterminable freedom and creativity. I believe human freedom is rooted in God, and that there cannot be real freedom outside God. I would therefore argue that robots, as not rooted in God, cannot be free. Free robots are a theological nonsense. And even if tomorrow someone said he created a robot out of love, I doubt that many men or women unable to have a child would settle for a robot, however intelligent this robot be. So, I would like us to look at 3 consequences of freedom. First of all, this God-given freedom comes at a certain price. Human beings were also created vulnerable. Now, vulnerability is mostly understood as the ability to be hurt and is often associated with sickness, disability and death. Yet, there is another way to look at human vulnerability. Vulnerability also creates openness in humanity. It allows human beings to love and to be loved. You cannot love if you are not vulnerable. And you cannot live if you are not loved. Hence, it doesn't come as a surprise when ethicist Henk ten Have writes, and I quote, "The struggle against vulnerability can easily result in the fiction that one can create invulnerabilities, making medicine unsustainable, chronic illness and disability meaningless, and death intolerable. Vulnerability can never be eliminated, since otherwise humanity itself would be erased." End of quote. Vulnerability creates spaces for hope. In the depths of an existence and in the abysses of vulnerability, hope is born for a brighter tomorrow. Indeed, I hope AI may succeed in easing the consequences of disability, like screen readers for people that are visually impaired. But if it were to eradicate vulnerability altogether, it would erase an essential aspect of what it means to be human. It would erase hope. Secondly, freedom of creation also leaves vulnerable human beings interdependent. As we are not puppets on a string, our agency is dependent on our capacity to reach out to each other. This interdependence accounts for the major part of our intelligence. Indeed, intelligence emerged in Homo sapiens out of a social necessity and through human encounter, and it makes little sense outside the realm of social interaction. Solidarity is a direct consequence of our dependent state. Caring for others and receiving care from others, what some may call charity, is a crucial aspect of human flourishing. Being dependent on care of others is something most people in our Western societies have difficulty to accept. On this issue, theologian John Swinton writes, and I quote, "To be in a position where one can only be the recipient of care is not degrading. It is in fact a holy place. To receive care is a deep reflection of divine love for dependent human beings. It is simply a time in a person's life where the human vocation to care for creation and have dominion over it takes on a particular form." End quote. The Gospel of the foot washing in John 13 shows how the Apostle Peter cannot accept that Jesus washes his feet. But Jesus is very clear. Only if Peter accepts to be taken care of, accepts his dependent state, can he have part with God. If humanity developed AI that somehow eradicates human dependence on one another, and even human dependence on God, we would be atrophying our humanity and seriously constrain its capacity for growth in God. And don't think we're not doing this. Socially assistive robots are typically developed to be used in residential care, to entertain elderly people. And during the project with Robot Fee in the Netherlands, persons with intellectual disability managed to create meaningful relationships, like friendships, with an android robot. Can we really delegate the command to love our neighbor to a robot? Finally, freedom in creation implies uncertainty and doubt. Doubt is uncomfortable but essential, as the development of adversarial neural networks in machine learning tends to prove. These mechanisms simulate doubt in machine learning processes. So there is something crucial in our freedom to doubt. Our human capacity to doubt underlies our human capacity to believe and to have faith, as the Gospel of Doubting Thomas illustrates magnificently well. There is nothing mechanical in this process. Not every human doubt is followed by human faith, but it is a possibility. Having faith, believing, is different from knowing, but is essential to the way we human beings relate to the world. I am not certain, I doubt, that we can develop the capacity for faith in artificial intelligence. In conclusion, it seems to me that vulnerability, interdependence and doubt are in no way errors to be deleted, as they are inextricably linked to the theological virtues of hope, charity and faith. And yes, I do hope AI may help us ease some of the more negative side effects of extreme vulnerability. And surely AI could be used to strengthen ties between dependent people. And maybe AI could even help us to become better doubters. I would just encourage us to carefully consider where we want the limits. And in my opinion, aiming for a world without vulnerability, dependence and doubt is definitely not an option. Thanks a lot.